Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a second here. Just as a slightly different approach to the start, I thought I would give everybody an indication of the tech pieces that we're going to use. So you're muted by default, and you can see that with the bar, the navigation bar that comes with Zoom. And we're going to use the chat box for questions. So if you don't have that up, make sure that you get that up. And I'll also note down at the bottom here, make sure that in your chat box, you've chosen all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the questions that you send. And just to test both the audio and the chat box, if you can hear me, can you just drop a quick message in there to say so? Great, thanks everybody. Okay, so without further ado, we'll get started here. There'll probably be a couple of other people who will sign on in the next couple of minutes, but this is the next Mistacus Monday webinar presentation. Thank you to all of you for participating, especially since I know this is actually a holiday for some people, but we wanted to keep with our Mistacus Monday webinars. This one's on conservation easements and their connection to conservation biology, conservation in a very broad sense. So my name is Guy Greenaway. I'm Senior Project Manager at the Mistacus Institute. And like I said, our quick overview of tech for those who may have just joined us, you're muted by default. We will use the chat box for questions. So that chat box will be, if it's not there, go to that navigation bar and you can bring it up and make sure you choose all panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your question. Okay, so just for those of you who are not familiar with the Mistacus Institute, I'll start by saying Mistacus is a not-for-profit organization. We're a registered charity and an applied research institute affiliated with Mount Royal University here in Calgary. And our tech is having a little lag time here. And actually, I'll note that for everybody. If you are having any problems with the sound or any problems with the video, please note that in the chat box as well, and I can take care of that right away. So our goal is a world where communities have genuine access to the science and research they need to make choices that promote healthy landscapes. And the work that we do is to make that innovative research available to communities and decision makers. And when we say decision makers, we mean everyone from a government agency to an individual landowner to a municipality to an industry player, anyone who's making a decision that has an impact on the health of our landscapes. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk through conservation easements at a fairly general level. I'll go into specifics of the conservation easement tool, but not specifics of any one conservation easement. They all have their own character, their own differences, but just talk about the function, the effect that they have, and how compensation works for easements. A little bit about land trust, because sometimes we skip over that piece and it's not clear to everybody the role that a land trust plays, or what a land trust is, even different from a conservation easement. I've in the past had calls where people have said, I'm interested in putting a land trust on my property, and just even that level of lack of understanding of how the organization differs from the actual tool. And then the meat of the presentation today, although it will be probably about half of the presentation because I need to set the structure in those first two pieces. But ultimately what I want to get to is conservation easements and conservation biology, because sometimes we get too focused on the mechanisms and not enough on how we connect the mechanism to the actual goal. So hopefully at the end of this, everybody has a sense of that connection. It may be the case that some of the pieces that I'm going through are a little bit too much detail for folks who have greater understanding of the tools, but I'm going to try and bring us all up to the sort of same level. So what is a conservation easement? It's a contractual arrangement. It's between a landowner and a qualified organization. I'm going to talk about that in a second. The landowner voluntarily relinquishes certain land use opportunities. So this is not a regulatory tool, it's a voluntary contract. And it's granted to the qualified organization in favor of conservation, meaning the whole point of this agreement and it's being enabled in legislation is to accomplish and to facilitate certain types of conservation. That's then registered on the land title, and it runs with the land regardless of who the owner is. So the landowner is free to sell, will, gift, pass on that land, but because the easement is registered on the land title, it runs with the land regardless of who the owner is. So how they work, my little cartoon diagram here, is if you imagine a piece of land and the owner of that land having a variety of opportunities, things that they can do on that land. They might be able to harvest trees, graze cattle, irrigate crops, cultivate those crops, build buildings, subdivide it, apply to their municipality to have it subdivided, and a whole bundle of things that some of them are rights, some of them are opportunities that they can apply for, but as an individual landowner, you have all of those possibilities. With the qualified organization, once the landowner decides to enter into an agreement with a qualified organization, which be a land trust, or in other cases, I'll describe the other types of qualified organizations, you identify certain of those rights or opportunities, and those are then provided through the easement to the qualified organization. Now, one thing to be clear about is what happens is they are restricted through this agreement. It doesn't mean that now the land trust has the ability to build or the ability to subdivide it, but the landowner retains all of those other rights and opportunities that they had, just the ones that are specifically outlined in the conservation agreement with specific restrictions on them are the ones that are subject to the conservation easement agreement, and the ones that carry on with the land regardless of the landowner. So what can they be used for? In Alberta, you can use them for the protection, conservation, and enhancement of the environment, natural, scenic, or aesthetic values, agricultural land, or land for agricultural purposes. And in Alberta, we have used them exclusively for the environment, but what usually happens in the drafting of a conservation easement is that the organization who's doing it can look at a variety of values or a variety of benefits that come from that property, and in the crafting of the easement ensure that those things are protected as well. But the primary purpose can only be for one of these things. To my knowledge, we've never had a conservation easement in Alberta that was for scenic or aesthetic values. And agricultural land, there's a number of folks who are working on trying to create agricultural land opportunities for conservation easements, but again, to date, we haven't really used it for that purpose, aside from it being an ancillary purpose to a conservation easement that has an environment focus. And the organizations that are working on these conservation easements, organizationally, they may have a variety of purposes that include agriculture, include scenic values, and other components of a land's value or opportunities, but the easement has to be for one of these. Currently, they're all enabled currently, as of 2009, they're all enabled under the Alberta Land Stewardship Act. We've had easements since the mid-90s. It used to be in the Environmental Enhancement and Protection Act, but it's a provincial piece of legislation that enables this. So how do they affect a parcel? They affect the parcel by putting restrictions and prescriptions on land use and land management. And it's important to note those two words. So the restrictions, obviously meaning the things that you're not allowed to do. And in that way, it's similar to the long-standing tool of a restrictive covenant. But conservation easements also have the ability to do prescriptions, meaning requiring certain things to be done. The most common ones that or some of the most common ones that you might see where there are restrictions or prescriptions are things like subdivision and restrictions on building. And I starred those ones because pretty much every conservation easement has those. But there can also be restrictions on timber harvest and tree removal, on mining and excavations, especially gravel for a lot of cases, drainage of water, fencing, water pollution. There can be a number of restrictions that are written into the conservation easement, and every easement will be slightly different. And every organization that does easements starts at a slightly different point. They'll have their template easement and they'll start negotiating off of that. Generally, they're perpetual. You can write easements for a term, but generally they run with the land in perpetuity. And especially if you want to access certain funding programs or certain other opportunities, they need to be perpetual. A question that often comes up is whether or not they provide an opportunity for access, an opportunity for people outside of the landowner to access the property. For the easement holder, yes, it creates this opportunity for the landowner, for the easement holder to be able to come onto the property for certain things and in certain circumstances. And I say maybe for public because that's up to the landowner. If they want to write the easement so that it perhaps maintains or it encourages public access, you can do that, but there's no requirement within the legislation or within the best practices of easements. And in fact, for the most part, there's restrictions on public access. Like I mentioned before, there's no restrictions on the future dispositions, the sale, the will, any way that you might dispose of that property. It doesn't change any of that for the landowner. So who can hold a conservation easement? Like I said, it's what's called a qualified organization. And you can think of qualified organizations in, it's a little bit more broad than this, but essentially it boils down to a couple of different things. One is local or provincial government. So any agency of the government, of the provincial government, can hold a conservation easement. Any municipality can hold a conservation easement. But it's important to understand the difference between can hold and will hold. So an agency may have the ability and a municipality may have the ability, but have no interest in holding conservation easements. And there are a couple of municipalities in Alberta who have active conservation easement programs. Strathcona County, Flagstaff County, they're programs that were set up where the municipality has stepped forward and said, we've created this program, we specifically want to have conservation easements. Most conservation easements are held by a land trust or conservancy. You can use those words kind of interchangeably. These are the nonprofit registered charity organizations that have as a primary goal holding land or interest in land, like a conservation easement, for the purposes of conservation. So that's kind of the generic description of what a land trust or a conservancy is. One of the questions that comes up obviously quite quickly is how are landowners compensated for providing this grant of a conservation easement on their land? And I think the first piece is the one that we often skip over. It's to help them achieve their personal conservation goals. That's got to be primary, that's sort of front and center. And all of the other calculations that we sometimes default to pretty quickly, we have to remember that the history of this tool was, prior to it, if an individual landowner wanted to do something to maintain the conservation values of their property, they had limited choices, and all of those choices, like gifting the land to somebody else or providing it to the government, all of those had a huge financial impact on that landowner. So what the conservation easement was designed to do was to try and facilitate that ability and offset some of the impacts that they might otherwise face. So it all starts with that personal conservation goal. Then the main financial mechanism for compensating a landowner is a tax receipt. So a tax receipt provided by the charitable organization or the municipality or provincial government, they can provide tax receipts. Those are provided for the value of the conservation easement. And I'll describe how that is calculated in just a second. In some cases, there can be a cash payment as well. It's fairly rare for a cash payment to be provided for the entire value of the conservation easement. Usually what happens is there's a combination, or what we call a split receipt, where once the value is determined, the landowner is provided compensation for a portion of it through a tax receipt and a portion of it through a cash payment. And there are some constraints on exactly how that split receipt can work, but essentially it's just dividing those two opportunities, or sorry, combining those two opportunities in one transaction. I'll mention this one, but this one I mentioned more from the perspective of looking at conservation easements from a continental perspective, how they've been used over time. So a number of municipalities have received grants of conservation easements as part of a development approval process, where the developer is wanting to do something that is outside of perhaps what the planning framework in that area allows, and there's a negotiation between the municipality and the developer to say, well, if there's a conservation easement here, then maybe we can allow other things here. Now, a couple of key things here. One, like I said, that's not something that is commonly used. And two, because a tax receipt has to be provided as a donate, or in response to a donation, and a donation has to be, quote, free and without consideration. That means that if you're receiving something in return, you can't receive a tax receipt for that. So you can't mix charitable donations with a specific interest that you're looking to receive from granting a conservation easement. So how's the conservation easement value determined? Well, if you think of the financial value, the dollar value of a piece of land, I'll represent it with that entire bar. The way that a conservation easement is valued, and this is a simplification of a relatively complex process. You identify the fair market value, just like you would in any other parcel appraisal. So you need a qualified appraiser. They look at comparables, opportunities, development pressures, and they come up with a fair market value, willing buyer, willing seller, current market circumstances. And then you get, again, a qualified appraiser to do the same thing with the conservation easement in place, or as if the conservation easement is in place. So remember, you've got those restrictions. You can't subdivide it. You can't have a number of building opportunities. There may be no building opportunities. In that case, a lot of the financial value of the land is dramatically decreased, especially if you're in an area where there is significant development pressure, and that pressure is really driving the fair market value. So the difference between those two is considered to be the value of the conservation easement. And something here I just want to point out, because this is a point of sometimes misconception and definitely a point of contention, is the value of that land conservation easement is not based on its ecological value. The ecological value is an entirely different calculation, an entirely different process. When you're coming up with the dollar value for a conservation easement, it's through a process using fair market value. So for example, if you have two parcels, one may be a higher ecological value, but perhaps it's further away from a major city or where there's development pressures. And so its financial value, its fair market value is lower. Another parcel has a much higher ecological value, but it is, much lower ecological value, but it is very close to an area where there's a lot of development pressure. So its financial value is high. And so sometimes that's misunderstood for people. There are two things happening here in conjunction. One is the assessment of its ecological value for a whole variety of purposes on the part of the organization that's looking at this. And then the other is the financial value, which is a different kind of calculation. So how are conservation easements stewarded? What's the mechanism for making sure that those values are maintained? So first and foremost, the parcel has to be managed according to the restrictions that are in that conservation agreement. And increasingly, organizations are including a management plan that will be part of the conservation easement, sometimes even registered with the conservation easement. And that lays out all of the things that need to be done on that property to maintain the conservation values. So remember, I said that conservation easements can have restrictions as well as prescriptions. Well, this is the primary tool by which you would articulate those and ensure that those are happening. So it might be certain standards that grasslands have to be managed to, or certain standards that riparian areas have to be managed to, and that's all articulated within those plans. The other part, the critical part of stewarding, is the ongoing monitoring. So first and foremost, at the beginning, there's a baseline report that catalogs all of the values of the property, the features of the property, what makes it ecologically valuable in the first place. And then there are regular site visits, generally annually or sometimes biannually, where the qualified organization comes back onto the property and assesses against that baseline report just to see, is everything still okay? Are we still maintaining those conservation values? I think the most important part of stewardship is communication, communication, communication. So these are things like the site visits. It used to be that often those site visits would happen without the landowner. The best practice now is to use that as an opportunity to meet with the landowner, do the site visits, do the appraisal, that 1-year monitoring, have the landowner sign off on it, make sure that you're in constant communication with the landowner, that they have that feeling of ease of getting back in touch with the holder of the conservation easement to say, you know, I wondered about this, or this kind of thing is happening, or would this be okay, so that you have that ability to maintain the land in as smooth and seamless a way as possible, because it leads to this next piece, how easements are enforced. So every conservation easement, again, is different, but generally they all include this sort of trail of progressively more stringent things that can be done in order to enforce the provisions of the conservation easement. And again, first thing is communication. The second thing is that bargaining in good faith. So now that we've established that something is a problem, how do we work through that? Because the goal here is not to catch up the landowner. The goal here is to maintain the ecological value of the property. And there's a lot of different ways that that can happen. But this is a private contractual agreement, and so it has all of the remedies available to it that any other contract would have. The courts, there can be enforcement orders, there can be temporary stop orders for certain activities. All of those things are available as part of the suite of legal tools. One thing that's important to understand written into the legislation is that just because something wasn't monitored or something wasn't enforced, so for example, there was a contravention of the easement agreement and nobody did anything, that doesn't mean that the whole agreement fails. And I think this is the most important part to understand about enforcement. 95% of infractions of conservation easements are from simple lack of awareness. And it's why that communication and the bargaining in good faith are so important, because it starts with, I didn't realize that that wasn't something that I could do. And it's not a willful ignorance. It's often, oh, my cousin was here and random camping with his friends. I didn't realize that was a problem. Oh, I thought I could cut just a couple of those trees over there. I didn't realize that was a problem. And so that ongoing communication allows you to raise that awareness, make sure that that's happening, but at the same time, address those infractions in a way that, again, supports the conservation values of the property. So it's important to understand that land, a parcel of land management practices, and just the available information around it, all of that changes. This is not a static situation. These are constantly changing circumstances, constantly changing properties. Changing conservation easements may have significant ramifications. So balancing these 2 points and making sure that you have the flexibility, but still the stringency that allows the conservation easement to continue to do what it's supposed to do is the key mechanism or the key mentality around any sort of changes that happen. The way changes can happen is, first, the grantor and the grantee, so the landowner and the qualified organization, if they both agree on changes, those changes can happen. But again, that's subject to the basic overall goals of a conservation easement. They can't come together and agree, we're going to build a 50-story building on top of that area that was conserved, and we're still calling it a conservation easement. Those things are still the base principles. Once those changes are committed to, those have to be re-registered at the land titles office, and again, run with a conservation easement. If that whole transaction was subject to a certification of as a gift of ecological property, I'll talk about that in just a second, then there needs to be coordination, notifications with the Eco Gifts program to make sure that those changes are fine as well. This last one, I consider the boogeyman of the conservation easement legislation, because a lot of people, their eyebrows shoot up when they see this and heart rates go up a little bit. The Alberta Land Stewardship Act allows the minister in charge to make modifications to a conservation easement or even terminate it if it's in the public interest. But 2 important things here. One, we've had easements, conservation easements, since the mid-90s. This has never happened. But 2, and more importantly, even if we didn't have those clauses, these are more or less powers that are available to a provincial government already. So their ability to, again, in the public interest through mechanisms like expropriation or other kinds of sometimes compensated mechanisms, these are the kinds of changes that they can already make. So it doesn't really add something different to the mix, but like I said, it does sort of surprise people. So just quickly about the Ecological Gifts program. This is a federal program, and it's aimed at the tax advantages that you get from receiving a tax receipt in return for a conservation easement. It's jointly created, jointly managed between Finance and Environment and Climate Change Canada. So you get a little bit of the flavor of each of those agencies in this program. So the main thing it does is it provides enhanced tax benefits. So when you've donated a conservation easement, there are capital gains implications. This dramatically decreases that. And when you receive a tax receipt, you have the ability to use it just in general, a normal tax receipt, you have the ability to use it in the year you receive it and 5 additional years. This extends that to 10 years. So there are some significant tax benefits for the landowner. I think one of the most important things is that the appraisal, the financial appraisal that's submitted and reviewed by the Eco Gifts Committee, is then guaranteed. And so in a normal circumstance, the Canada Revenue Agency can come back afterwards a couple of years later and say, we want to reassess. In this case, what happens is Environment and Climate Change Canada guarantees that appraisal, which means that the CRA will go and fight with them instead of fighting with the landowner. So that's an important aspect. But increasingly, this is a problematic consideration. So what's called a change in use or changes in use of the land have to be reported to the EcoGifts program, and they have to be approved by the EcoGifts program. There's not a lot of clarity around exactly what constitutes a reasonable change in use. So because of that, we've tended to default to, well, any change is a bad change. And as I mentioned before, the constant change in the circumstances of the land, of land management, mean that this is a real problem if you can't have any change whatsoever. The reason why this becomes an even bigger problem is the land trust can face penalties of up to 50% of the fair market value of the property if those changes happen without the approval of the EcoGifts program. So it's a bit of a rough mechanism at the far end, even though at the near end, those tax benefits are very, very valuable. Okay, just quickly about land trusts. And again, land trusts and conservancies, I'm going to use the terms sort of interchangeably. The basics: they're a nonprofit charitable organization. So the land trust or conservancy is the organization, the conservation easement is the tool. Their core activity is to accept gifts of land or interest in land, except conservation easements, always voluntary, given or sold for the purpose of conservation. So this is not a regulatory entity, and even when these kinds of activities are pursued by a government agency, it's still not in a regulatory environment. This is a voluntary circumstance. And then the hallmark of land trusts is direct action taken to protect the land, and this is where the wording comes in trust for future generations. And I'll just flag a little side note here. If you're ever doing research on this and you come across the term community land trust, just be aware that's an entirely different type of organization, and it's about organizations that create affordable housing, just by adding the word community in front of there. So if you've ever come across that and it's confused you, that's the reason. Key characteristics of land trusts: they can serve natural, scenic, historical, agricultural, recreation values, other values. Like I've mentioned before, this list is longer than the list of purposes for conservation easements. Land trusts can do a large variety of things as well as what conservation easements allow for. They work with interested private landowners in different projects, and they use these suite of securement tools, the main ones being fee simple or full title purchase and conservation easements. And they're funded by donations and grants. And so they're an entirely private organization, but a private, not-for-profit charitable organization. One of the things that's sometimes confusing is they can range very dramatically in size. So a land trust might be a group of people in the local community conserving a single property, and that's all they do for the rest of their time as an organization. And that's an entirely legitimate structure, and there are many, many of those across the continent. Or they can be larger, they can be regional, they can be provincial, they can be national, and we have large national ones like Ducks Unlimited and the Nature Conservancy that have Alberta arms. We have cross-province ones like the Alberta Conservation Association or Fish and Game Association, and we have regional ones. All of these are organizations that are active in Alberta doing conservation easements in different areas across different portions of the province, and each with different goals. So a conservation easement, I mentioned, is going to be different in terms of each easement agreement because of the landowner and the land, but the starting point is going to be different. Each of these organizations has a slightly different set of, or sometimes very different set of priorities and goals. So it's important when you're looking at the easement to understand the organization that's holding it. Okay, so this is where I wanted to try and bring these things together and talk about, yes, these are the structures, the conservation easements. These are the organizations that primarily drive the use of conservation easements in conjunction with landowners. But the whole point is supposed to be about conservation biology. And there's, if you look in the literature, a lot of clash between organizations and individuals and academics who are focused on private land conservation as their starting point versus others who are focused on conservation biology as their starting point. And where do those things overlap? How do they connect? So a couple of things I wanted to do was first talk about conservation easements and conservation biology. And I'm kind of going to overlap a little bit between some of the private land conservation in general, not just the conservation easement values as well. So for conservation biology, private land can be critically important. And we see that in a lot of international initiatives like the Convention for Biological Diversity, the IUCN, even the World Commission on Protected Areas. They're all looking at private land and saying, increasingly, this is a very important set of lands that are on an entirely different land ownership, but they are important for biodiversity conservation. They often have really high value habitats, and they tend to be high productivity lands. And I don't mean productivity from just an agricultural perspective, although that's included in there as well. But I mean productivity from, from a primary productivity perspective. So we can see quite easily in the analyses that are done of protected areas that we tend to put those in areas of low productivity, low biodiversity in a lot of cases. They're correlated very heavily with steep slopes and areas that are frankly just undevelopable. And we see that there isn't a lot of focus on areas that have higher densities of people, higher densities of development. Now, in one case, that makes sense. When you have a greater level of human activity, you can naturally see a decrease in biodiversity. But important word is can naturally see a decrease in biodiversity, because that's not always the case. And there was recently a new paper that came out that was looking at key biodiversity areas, or KBAs, and that's just what it suggests, ignoring the land ownership or management or regulatory perspective and just saying where are the areas that are important for biodiversity, and then overlaying that with the management structure and the different mechanisms. And increasingly we're seeing that these KBAs don't necessarily overlap well with where we have chosen to try and do protection. And now we've got a situation where we're looking at areas with a very complex land use matrix. So protected areas are a simple land use matrix. That's sort of the point. It's supposed to be just one landowner, one management regime, one management plan. But when you get into areas where there's a whole bunch of things going on, it's much more complex and it's much more difficult. And so not surprisingly, we've tended to avoid that. I'm going to see if I can show you this video that Justin Thompson from the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society shared with me. It's just a 1-minute video, but I think it really emphasizes the value of private lands. Can someone just text me and tell me if they see the video of diverse wildlife on private land sitting at the top of their screen now? Okay, great. So the key thing here is to look at that tree and look at the cows. So this is an area that's actively used for cattle ranching. And that tree has had a camera set up on it over obviously many seasons. But you see the variety of wildlife that are in this area intermixing with what is a commercial operation, a commercial ranch. So increasingly we've got this kind of situation where this is not appropriate for different kinds of conservation biology protection that we've used in the past, but it's pretty clear from looking at who's using this area that this is an incredibly diverse area. It's actually going to be included in the maps that I'm going to show you in a couple of seconds here, but I just wanted you guys to see this as part of my favorite. The very curious bear who decided that the camera was something that needed further investigation. And it's clearly a rub tree as well. So the bears that are going through here, big and little, using it for that. So I'll just head back here to the presentation. And if somebody can give me a quick, yeah, I can see that presentation again. Great. So a couple of other quick points about these areas. A lot of the times when we're talking about conservation biology, we're talking about that sort of basic model of cores and connectivity. And it's easier to conceive of how we protect the biodiversity in the cores, but that connectivity is so important, and that connectivity often goes through, again, these complex land use matrix lands, these areas that are maybe lower quote unquote biodiversity value, but the connective tissue value of them is really important. And conservation easements can play a huge role in providing opportunities there. The other thing is these working lands, like I showed in that video. So instead of saying it's a one or the other, can we find ways to ensure that those land use activities that are working land activities like forestry, ranching, for example, can continue? The landowner can continue to generate revenue off of that, but we can also do something that maintains the conservation values in there. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, uses this phrase, and I love this phrase, talks about the ecological middle class. So he's referring to not the areas that are the most important and the most special ever. It's the stuff that's sort of in between. An analogy would be like, if you have a class of 30 kids, you can't just teach the 2 smartest kids. It's an entire system. We have to address the entire system. And conservation easements do a really good job of addressing those areas that are of middle importance in terms of a one-off consideration, but of vital importance in terms of an entire system. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in just a second, but control of public access is another piece in conservation easements, because where we have tended to focus our protective activities has been on public land, which by default allows public access. We sort of default to assuming that public access of every type has to happen, and especially recreation. And that's not the case on private land. And those activities can have a huge impact, a huge detrimental impact on biodiversity. And there's an opportunity to control that with a tool like the conservation easement. So for example, when we're looking at this national effort, the pathway to target 1, they call it, the effort to have 17% of our land base protected, areas like this in the bottom right-hand corner, because they're a national park with a heavy level of use, immediately get included. And areas like this are very challenged to be included in those calculations. Conservation easement here on a very large commercial operation. It's a ranching operation, but incredibly high biodiversity. So conservation easements help us get at some of these places where we have a bit of a cognitive dissonance between what actually is protected and what actually is biodiverse. Okay, so just because it's conservation easement, does that mean that it is conserving biodiversity? Definitely not. The first step in establishing the ecological importance of the areas is those baseline reports. So you have to start with conservation goals. You have to start with saying, this is what is important and this is what is here. And that's what the baseline reports do. Also, the land trusts and conservancies that work on this are looking at a variety of other aspects. They're looking at regional assessments, they're looking at internal assessments that they've done, they're making their prioritization lists, and all of those are based on ecological criteria as well. And then that monitoring, and I think one of the things that easements has that a lot of other mechanisms we use for protecting biodiversity is very, very robust, because that monitoring happens on a regular basis, and it's always based on that baseline report. What changed? Is that good? Is that bad? What's happening for the conservation values that we identified here? Plus, there's often another layer. So funding programs for these land trusts and for conservation easements. So in Alberta, we have the Land Trust Grants Program. Federally, I mentioned the Ecological Gifts Program. Each of these has an ecological assessment as well that the participants in those programs have to demonstrate. So we have a couple of layers of protection from that perspective. Okay, I'm going to show an example to try and hopefully illustrate all of this in a very specific example. So if we look at Alberta down in the far southwest corner in the Crow's Nest Pass, or Highway 3, one of the trans-provincial highways that goes through the mountains and into BC right there. If I believe many of you are familiar with the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which is trying to put together a number of different mechanisms that maintain connectivity across the entire continent from the Yellowstone to Yukon. So that little white star that I have there on the map of Alberta is, hopefully you can see this, I'll try and point it out here, the little white star here. So this is an area that sits right in the middle of this continental context as well. So what we have here is what's known as the Rock Creek Corridor, and organizations like the Southern Alberta Land Trust Society have taken the lead in trying to maintain connectivity in this area. As I mentioned before, we've got this highway that's currently a 2-lane highway and is perpetually proposed to be a 4-lane highway running through this area. And we have this very diverse matrix of types of land use here. So everything that's in this green with the cross hatching that is slightly darker green is crown land, is public land. And the areas that have this yellow cross-hatching over top are where there are existing conservation easements. The areas that are in darker yellow are priority 1 areas for this program, the lighter yellow priority 2 areas. And this area that I'm outlining, hopefully you can see that it's outlined in red, is actually a little bit out of date because there are already conservation easements on a number of these parcels as well. But they're an example of an organization like SALT targeting an area and saying, we want to try and increase conservation easements in this area. So when we're talking about wildlife moving across this highway and trying to figure out how wildlife can move across this highway, and we're trying to make the case with the transportation agencies that mitigation needs to happen in areas like this, mitigation needs to happen in areas like this, it's that bigger context that's required. And if all you can say is that we're dumping out wildlife on either side and crossing our fingers, it's a very difficult case to make. So we have, again, this broader landscape. So these green areas in the bottom left and in the top left are the forest reserve, areas that can be very valuable for wildlife movement. But what happens when we get into these areas that are very important for wildlife movement, but are more into that, again, that more complex land use? So this is an example of trying to fill in these spaces to make a contiguous corridor here. But this also sits within a larger consideration. So again, we've got our little area that I was just showing you. It's around this where the number 3 is. That's Highway 3 going through here. And again, the green crosshatching, or green areas with the darker green crosshatching is Crown lands, all up through the Livingston Range. This is Highway 22, or the Cowboy Trail, it's often called, coming down and meeting up with Highway 3. Conservation easements here, public land here, and conservation easements here. The use of conservation easements in conjunction with other types of land use, other types of protection, can be extremely valuable in trying to maintain those, like I said, the connective tissue between these areas. So to me, this is the nexus of conservation biology and conservation easements, is using them thoughtfully and creatively with scientific basis and information to choose opportunities that our existing protection tools are not capable of bringing forward any sort of protective activity. But at the same time, we also maintain the stewards that are currently on that land, those ranchers that are in this area in this case, and maintaining their ability to continue to pay taxes to the local municipality, continue to derive an income off of that area, continue to have the heritage values that they associate with their landscape. So that's my sort of final example to bring together why I think conservation biology and conservation easements make such an important nexus. I'll mention a couple of things here. If you want more information about conservation easements, the Mistakis Institute and the Environmental Law Center created this website, Conservation Easements in Alberta. It's at ce-alberta.ca. And the Conservation Easements website is set up in 2 pieces. There's the basic questions and the advanced questions. So if you're just getting into this, what is a conservation easement? There's a section there. But if you're getting into more detailed information, like what happens when we have multiple purposes for a conservation easement? How would you draft that? And what would that look like? It tries to get at some of those questions as well. And the last resource I'm going to mention, which is a new resource, the Mistakis Monday webinars, we decided that the most efficient way to get this information out to you guys now is to just put everything up on our website. So you can go to the Mistakis website, which is rockies.ca, and just navigate to our resource library and you'll see the webinars tab there. Or you can go directly there, rockies.ca/webinars.php, and that will take you directly to the webinars page. On there, what we have currently is all of the previous webinars. So brief description, the slide deck is there, and the recording of the webinar is there as well. So every time we finish a webinar, we'll be posting it there. I think we're also going to start doing the the promotion of the upcoming webinars through there as well. We'll still send that out through our newsletter. We'll still make sure that everybody on the newsletter list gets that notification about it. But I know there have been some challenges for people sharing the links and not having a current link to share with some of their colleagues. And the last thing I'll leave you with, as usual, is my contact information with the usual caveat. Email me, usually I say if you want the slide deck, but it'll all be on the website. And currently, don't phone that number. That is the Mistakis Institute office, so you can jot that down and set it aside for when we are all back in our office. Currently, we're all working from home. So like I said, if you have any questions for me, you can contact me at guy@rockies.ca. And now I'm just going to go through the chat box and see if there are some questions here. First question was, thanks, Guy. I'm wondering if there is a data set available that documents the amount of conservation easements within an area. For example, number within a watershed. Working on a state of watershed report and capturing a snapshot in the watershed would be good information. Those who know me and the work that I'm doing right now are probably chuckling. We've been trying to come up with a robust and accessible database of all of the private land conservation in Alberta. I'm hoping that we're getting closer to working towards that. That Pathway to Target 1 initiative is providing us some impetus to help with that. But there's a couple of things that you can do. So in the meantime, first thing you can do is contact the land trust in your area. They'd be more than happy to let you know what lands are subject to conservation easements in your area. And you can look at that Conservation Easements Alberta website and find out who all of the land trusts are, and each of them lists their focus area, so you can check that. I know that's an awkward one. The Land Stewardship Centre of Canada, based in Edmonton, they maintain a conservation easement registry. So what it does is just automatically troll the land titles database and gather where there are conservation easements. You have to enter specific requests, like I want to know if there's an easement on this place. But if you contacted them directly, I'm sure they would be willing to help you figure out a way to get information that covers that entire area. So I'm sorry that's an incomplete answer, but you put your finger directly on one of the things that's a huge challenge for us. We don't know where these areas are in a lot of cases, and that's to protect the privacy that has been promised to the landowners that are working with qualified organizations. But increasingly, we're finding land use planning is happening without this information. So we have to figure a better way that provides this information, but still maintains that privacy. Next question, under the MG, the Municipal Government Act, they are to look at, quote, highest and best use. How does that compare? Oh, I think that is from the perspective of assessment. So again, highest and best use would be, and I'm guessing this is from Gloria. Gloria, you'll tell me if I got the question wrong, but I'll answer it this way. It would use exactly the same mechanism. So under the Municipal Government Act, assessment of lands put to municipalities, it basically comes under essentially one or two of two categories. It's either fair market value or it's agricultural land and then assessed in a different way. There's no difference here for the evaluations that are done for conservation easement lands or land subject to conservation easement. So it would be, what is the fair market value of this land in its current situation? And even if it's agricultural land, it could be sold and developed, so it's still the highest and best use. And then the conservation easement is, but what if it didn't have any of these things? The ability to subdivide, the ability to build. So it would be the exact same mechanism that's designed to tie into the same way that assessments are done already. And so I'll just see if Gloria answers that to say whether I got it. Next question is, Guy, I'd like to have a production date on the PowerPoints, especially as this is changeable information and it will be available long-term on the website. Okay, I put the date on the very first slide for each of these. I think I used to. I'll check and make sure I do. And if I don't, I'll make sure to have that. And are there any other questions coming up here? Gloria has said it is currently used to redesignate to any use versus conservation easement. I'm not sure I understand what that means. Maybe Gloria, if you want to fire me an email, we can have that conversation. I can get a little more clear what it is that you're asking about, and hopefully give you a little more clear information. Okay, just give it a couple of seconds, see if anybody else has any other comments. One thing I'll just mention to people, you've got my email there. Just in general with these Mistakis Monday webinars, some of you are very familiar with the work that Mistakis does in all of our different areas, and you may have a suggestion of a webinar topic that you think would be a good one for us to provide. So if so, please let me know, because we're hoping to continue these on as long as we possibly can. And I think that's it for questions. Well, again, I want to thank everybody for participating. And like I said, all of this information will be on the website, and we will be posting the information, the links for the next webinars coming up right away. So again, thanks very much, everybody.